In the 16th century, the most heavily guarded room in the sprawling Ottoman Empire wasn't, the royal treasury. It
Right.
wasn't the imperial armory either. It was actually a room where a single man tended a single fire, cooking a single pot of stew.
Which is just wild to think about.
It really is. So today, we are taking you into a stack of historical texts detailing the Matbaa Yumia. That's the legendary kitchens of the Topkapi Palace.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission for this deep dive is to uncover why the absolute greatest threat to a massive, multi-continental dynasty wasn't like an invading army massing on a distant border.
Yeah, it was a poorly vetted bowl of soup.
Exactly. We are looking at how dining in this environment was just this incredibly complex, terrifying web of high-stakes security, geopolitical maneuvering, and, well, day-to-day survival.
What's fascinating here is that we tend to view historical palaces primarily as opulent residences or maybe, administrative hubs.
Like really fancy houses.
Right, just fancy houses. But Topkapi was the absolute unyielding center of power for an empire that bridged Europe, Asia, and Africa. Wow.
And within that massive fortified power center, the dining table was paradoxically its most fragile, vulnerable point. Every single meal was a calculated risk.
A potential vector for the immediate collapse of the state.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this because the sheer mind-boggling scale of what we're looking at in these sources is really hard to conceptualize. When we look at the historical culinary dictionaries from the era, they detail an operation that completely defies our modern understanding of a kitchen.
Oh, absolutely.
We are not talking about like a big room with a few ovens and a head chef. The Matbaa Emir was effectively an industrial city operating within the palace walls.
Yeah, it was massive.
It was an organization churning out tens of thousands of portions every single day, and this is without modern refrigeration, without electricity.
Just sheer human labor.
Right. Sheer human labor and extreme logistical discipline.
The logistics of that scale in the 1500s are just staggering. You have to imagine a daily influx of raw materials that looks like, well, like a military supply chain.
Literally an army of food. Yeah. We are talking about hundreds of wagons of wood, immense flocks of sheep, and entire guilds of artisans delivering produce daily. It required an army of specialized bakers, confectioners, meat roasters.
Vegetable prep workers, yeah.
All moving in this highly orchestrated, almost militaristic rhythm. There were distinct kitchens for the palace guards, the harem, the administrative elite.
Operating simultaneously.
Exactly, all under a massive roof with 60 soaring chimneys.
So it's this rigid hierarchy, essentially an absolute control mechanism disguised as a culinary operation. But here is the detail from the text that really demands scrutiny.
Okay.
Amidst this sprawling, chaotic operation feeding thousands of people daily, the Sultan's food was entirely isolated.
Completely cut off.
Right. It was prepared in a completely separate micro-kitchen called the kushan, using separate pots, completely separate cooks, and even separate fires.
Mm.
And I have to push back on this a little bit, actually. I understand isolating the premium ingredients, sure, but building entirely separate fires seems like extreme overkill.
It sounds like it, yeah.
I mean, maybe even just a massive royal ego trip. Does a shared fire actually pose a real security threat, or is that just about projecting status?
Well, it is really easy to view it as theatrical extravagance. And, the Ottomans certainly understood the power of prestige. But the separate fires were fundamentally, practically about imperial security.
Really, just the fire itself?
Yes. You have to view this physical isolation as their very first line of defense. Fire is a point of physical intervention.
I see.
If you share a massive communal hearth with the cooks making bulk stews for the palace guards, there are dozens of hands, hundreds of passing bodies, and literally thousands of opportunities for cross-contamination.
Or intentional poisoning.
Exactly, intentional poisoning. By dedicating a separate fire in a sequestered room handled by a highly vetted microscopic staff, you violently limit the variables.
You control the environment.
Right. You are controlling the physical environment to an absolute degree, establishing a secure chain of custody from the raw ingredient to the cooking vessel to the flame itself.
Okay, so securing the fire makes logical sense. You narrow the perimeter. But unless the Sultan's eating directly off the stove inside that sequestered room, that food still has to travel.
It does.
A locked door in the kitchen doesn't protect a plate of food in a busy hallway. So how did they solve that physical transit gap between the secure fire and the dining chamber?
That is the exact vulnerability they had to address next. Securing the cooking process was entirely useless if the food was compromised in transit.
Right.
This required a shift from physical environmental security to intense, highly regulated human protocols.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When we turn to the extensive historical studies documenting palace protocols, they introduce us to a specific elite role in the palace hierarchy.
The Sessheniger?
Yes, the Sishnigan.
Yeah.
These are the official palace food tasters, and their job description was terrifyingly straightforward. They tasted the sultan's food first.
And if it was poisoned?
They died.
Yeah. Your entire utility to the state is directly tied to your mortality. It is a grim reality for those individuals.
But wait, logistically, how did that even work in practice? Like, if a taster eats poisoned food, it often takes hours for the physiological symptom to appear, right?
Generally, yes.
Did the sultan just sit there staring at his dinner getting cold, waiting to see if the sea snicker collapsed?
Well, that is a crucial mechanical distinction. They weren't typically dealing with slow-acting, subtle toxins in this specific scenario.
Oh, they weren't.
No. If someone is bold enough to poison the sultan's dinner, they are using acute, fast-acting agents. Massive doses of arsenic or botanical toxins like aconite.
Stuff that works fast.
Right. Toxins which induce violent symptoms almost immediately. But more importantly, the Sisniger system was as much a psychological deterrent as it was a physiological filter.
Oh, that makes sense.
If a potential assassin knows a highly trained expert is going to inspect, smell, and consume the food before it reaches the target, the likelihood of attempting the poisoning drops drastically.
It is about creating an impossible obstacle course for an assassin. And the obstacle course didn't just rely on the tasters either. The sources detail a strict, almost paranoid transit protocol. The meals were placed in specialized heavy containers, usually copper or silver, covered with a specialized cloth. Then, the pantry masters physically sealed them with wax bearing the imperial stamp. Those seals could not be broken by anyone on the journey.
Right.
It immediately makes me think of ordering food today. You know when you get delivery from an app and the restaurant puts that little tamper-proof sticker across the paper bag?
Oh, yeah, always.
It gives you a tiny bit of peace of mind. Except, instead of worrying if a delivery driver ate a French fry on the way to your house, the stakes here are the literal catastrophic collapse of a global empire.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the wax seals, the transit protocol, and the deadly role of the Sesshenier reveal the intense psychological weight of holding power in the Ottoman world.
It's heavy.
It really is. It demonstrates a profound, institutionalized realization by the leadership. The greatest existential threat to their empire wasn't a foreign power. It was the mundane biological necessity of eating a meal.
I mean, you construct a security apparatus, this incredibly elaborate, sealed containers, designated martyrs for tasters, entirely separate fires. It points to a deeply ingrained institutional paranoia.
For sure.
You don't build a fortress around a bowl of soup unless you are absolutely certain someone is actively trying to poison it. Which leads to the most obvious question.
Who is breaking the wax seal?
Exactly. Who exactly were they protecting the Sultan from? Because the natural assumption is foreign assassins, spies from rival nations, the Habsburgs or the Safavids, infiltrating the kitchens to decapitate the empire's leadership.
That would be the logical assumption.
But when we dive into the historical records regarding the imperial harem, the threat profile shifts dramatically. The danger wasn't coming from outside the walls.
No, it wasn't.
It was coming from the people sleeping under the exact same roof.
The internal dynamics of the Ottoman palace, particularly within the royal family itself, were incredibly fraught. We're talking about a system where succession was not dictated by primogeniture.
Meaning the automatic inheritance by the eldest son.
Right. The Ottomans practiced a system that often resulted in a fiercely contested, brutal competition among all male heirs.
Wow.
During certain periods, this was legally codified by laws of governance that essentially sanctioned fratricide. A new sultan was legally permitted, even expected, to execute his brothers to prevent civil war and fracture of the state.
So every meal with a brother or a half-sibling is literally a high-stakes standoff.
Absolutely.
But the sources reveal a truly surprising fact here. Direct, successful assassinations via poisoned food were actually incredibly rare in Ottoman history. The physical security measures largely worked.
They did.
Wait, if assassinations by poison were actually that rare, why spend a fortune on a massive network of tasters in sealed pots? Were they just blindly paranoid, wasting resources on a phantom threat?
The paranoia wasn't a waste of resources. The paranoia was the point.
Oh, really?
Yes, it was a Cold War. And in a Cold War, the weapon you use most often isn't the bomb itself. It is the constant, suffocating fear of the bomb.
Wow, that's intense.
The fear of poison became a highly effective tool of control and manipulation. It dictated the daily lives, the shifting alliances, and the power dynamics of the palace elites. Think about the era of Suleiman the Magnificent and Hurrem Sultan.
Right.
The internal power balances completely dictated mundane life. You are sharing meals with rival factions within the harem, knowing that any one of them might view your quiet death as their only path to political survival.
You literally couldn't trust the cup of water your own family was handing you.
Yeah.
The psychological toll of that, every sip, every bite of bread being a calculated risk assessment must have been exhausting.
Damn exhausting.
It completely shatters our modern, romanticized understanding of these lavish royal banquets. They weren't relaxing family dinners. They were tense diplomatic summits where everyone was mutually assured of their own vulnerability.
And this environment of intense suspicion meant that the people who controlled the food logistics, the chief cooks, the pantry masters, the inner circle of the kitchens, wielded an immense amount of soft power.
Oh, they were the gatekeepers.
They were the ultimate gatekeepers. Access to the Sultan's food meant access to the Sultan's life.
So if food is recognized as the ultimate weapon, a vector for death, the sources show us that the Ottomans also proactively weaponized it as a shield.
They did.
They used their ingredients for life, for health, and for extreme exclusivity. This brings us to the concept of the Matba Emir as a secret pharmacy. The palace kitchens weren't just pumping out calories to keep the guard standing, they were actively formulating complex medicines.
This is one of the most compelling aspects of the Ottoman culinary worldview. At this level of elite society, the dividing line between a master chef and a physician was virtually non-existent.
That's so interesting.
They viewed culinary arts and medical science as a single, unified continuum. You didn't just eat to be full, you ate to balance the body.
The source material dives deep into this specific mechanism, particularly regarding sherbets. Now today, for you listening, when you hear sherbet or sorbet, you picture like a scoop of icy, fruity dessert.
Right, like an ice cream parlor.
Exactly. But in the Topkapi Palace's Helvahan, that's the specialized dessert and pharmacy kitchen sherbets, were these incredibly elaborate, highly potent liquid concoctions. They were flavored with intensely rare ingredients: pomegranate, rose, ambergris derived from whales, and musk extracted from deer glands.
Yeah, very rare stuff.
They weren't passing these around on a hot afternoon just to be refreshing. They were specifically formulated and strictly prescribed by the chief physicians as medicine.
And modern science actually provides fascinating context for this. The sources point directly to the phytochemistry of the spices they were hoarding. They utilized heavy amounts of cinnamon, clove, and ginger. Under the prevailing medical theory of the time, which was humorism, these ingredients were used to balance the body's hot, cold, wet, and dry properties. But biochemically, they were actually doing something very real.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, cinnamon and clove contain highly active compounds like eugenol, which have profound antimicrobial and antiseptic properties. They actively disrupt bacterial cell membranes.
Wow.
Yeah. In an era centuries before antibiotics, your spice cabinet was your most effective defense against gastrointestinal illness.
So what does this all mean? The recipes for these specific medicinal sherbets and antimicrobial spice blends were heavily guarded state secrets.
Very closely guarded.
They were known only to a very select, elite tier of cooks and doctors within the palace. When you think about it, it is like having a modern bioweapons defense lab combined with your own personal, highly exclusive health insurance.
That's a great way to put it.
The specific ratios of those compounds are the only thing standing between the Sultan and an inevitable biological threat. You protect that recipe with your life because it literally sustains your life.
This raises an important question about how we view historical privilege. In the Ottoman worldview, culinary mastery was synonymous with medical supremacy.
Okay.
If you were the Sultan, controlling these secret botanical formulas, having exclusive, guarded access to the most potent healing ingredients the known world had to offer, was a profound geopolitical advantage.
I hadn't thought about it like that.
Yeah, you are actively fortifying your body, extending your lifespan, and protecting your immune system in a way the common citizen who is just scraping by on basic grains simply could not afford to do.
It is the ultimate, undeniable luxury: health as a strictly guarded, exclusive privilege. And that actually brings us to the final major theme we see across all these sources:
Which is?
how this immense culinary apparatus was used as a deliberate, calculated display of wealth and global dominance. Guarding these health formulas and rare spices wasn't just about keeping the Sultan alive in his private quarters. It was about projecting an image of invulnerability outward to the rest of the world. We see this extensively in the historical research, analyzing Ottoman cuisine and diplomacy.
The records clearly outline how the Ottomans actively weaponized the banquet table for international diplomacy. When you hosted foreign ambassadors, representatives of the Habsburgs, the Venetians, or rival empires, you didn't just provide a hospitable meal.
You overwhelmed their senses.
Exactly. You presented them with an extravagant, impossibly diverse spread of food that functioned as a direct, undeniable geopolitical statement. It said, I am powerful, my reach spans continents, and my resources are infinite.
It is culinary shock and awe. You serve a dish, heavily spiced with ingredients that had to travel by caravan across 3 continents through dangerous territory.
Right.
And you are casually demonstrating to the ambassador that you control the global trade routes. The food itself is the political language. But I want to explore how this language evolved as the world rapidly changed around them. The texts point out the disruption caused by the arrival of New World ingredients. Things that are so incredibly common to us today. Tomatoes, potatoes, certain types of peppers.
Right, the staples.
Yeah. They eventually make their way across the ocean and into the Ottoman Empire. Think about your own dinner tonight. It is wild to consider that a basic pantry staple, like a tomato, was once the disruptive new tech of the 16th and 17th century culinary world.
It really is wild.
So how exactly does a simple tomato change the power dynamic of a royal imperial kitchen?
It changes the dynamic entirely because it forces a massive adaptation in how prestige and power are displayed. Initially, these New World ingredients arrive as botanical novelties, rare curiosities grown in elite gardens.
So they were fancy at first.
Exactly. But as they adapt to the local climate, as global agricultural routes shift, crops like the tomato and potato begin to spread. They become cheaper.
Right.
They trickle down to the local farmers and eventually become staples of the common people's diet because they are hearty and calorically dense.
So the exclusivity is completely shattered. If the peasant in the street is eating a tomato, the Sultan cannot be seen serving a tomato to a foreign ambassador to project wealth.
Exactly the problem. The historians note a crucial sociological shift here. To maintain their aura of supremacy, the palace kitchens had to pivot. They doubled down on extreme complexity and impossible luxury.
How do they do that?
Well, they started importing incredibly expensive European culinary techniques or isolating even rarer spices from the Far East. This influx of new, eventually common ingredients actually widened the sociological gap. The diet of the palace elites and the everyday food of the common Ottoman citizen diverged sharply.
Because the palace had to continually invent an even more complex, unattainable cuisine just to prove they were still at the top of the hierarchy.
The growing disparity became a glaring sociological indicator of the empire's internal health. It wasn't just that the Sultan ate a larger volume of food. He was eating fundamentally different food, prepared in entirely different ways.
Took 2 different worlds.
Completely. The culinary language of the Topkapi Palace became entirely distinct from and mutually unintelligible with the culinary language of the streets of Istanbul.
It is a fascinating yet kind of tragic progression. We started by looking at how the Sultan isolated his food for physical security. The separate kushon fires, the sealed copper pots, the sheshnigir tasters,
Right.
all to protect against a physical drop of poison. But over time, as the world's economy shifted, that physical isolation evolved into a massive, insurmountable sociological isolation. The palace kitchen became an island of unimaginable culinary wealth, completely disconnected from the agricultural and daily reality of the empire it governed.
And historical precedent shows us that level of disconnect is always dangerous. When the food on the ruling table shares absolutely no DNA with the food on the citizen's table, you are looking at a society that is fundamentally fracturing from the inside out.
To summarize what we have unpacked today from this incredible stack of historical sources, a meal at Topkapi Palace was never, ever just a plate of food. From the industrial scale of the Makaba Yemar to the silent, tense dining chambers, it was a rigorous, terrifying security protocol.
It was.
It was a deeply psychological Cold War fought with the constant suffocating fear of poison among ambitious siblings. It was a secret pharmacy utilizing the cutting-edge phytochemistry of the era to ensure royal survival and longevity.
And ultimately, it was a grand theatrical display of geopolitical power, a way of consuming the world to prove you ruled it.
Exactly. The history of the Ottoman Empire wasn't just decided by generals on distant battlefields. It was simmering right there in the pot, sealed with wax, and tasted by a man who knew every single bite could be his last.
The layers of meaning embedded in something as simple as a shared meal are truly profound when you examine the mechanisms of history. And, it leaves you with something vital to consider about the nature of power itself.
Yeah.
If an empire's leadership becomes so obsessed with culinary isolation, eating entirely different foods, prepared on separate fires, completely detached from the local agriculture and the daily realities of their people, does that extreme physical and culinary isolation inevitably lead to political blindness?
That's a great point.
Think about the leaders of today, all around the world. How closely does what they eat resemble what is sitting on your own dinner table tonight? And what does that seemingly simple biological fact say about their true connection to you?